In today's discussion, I want to explore something that many of you have been trying to figure out for a long time. How to recognize when you might actually be the one for an avoidantly attached partner. There are certain behavioral patterns that can quietly reveal this, even when words are limited or inconsistent. One of the most important things to understand about avoidant individuals is that, like many attachment styles, they often carry an internal idea of the one. This is the person they unconsciously rank above others, the one they imagine staying with, the one they feel a deeper level of emotional commitment toward, even if they struggle to express it openly. This idea is surprisingly consistent. Whether they consciously acknowledge it or not, many avoidant individuals do operate with this internal concept of a single, significant person who feels different from everyone else. And because of that, they tend to be much slower when it comes to committing. Not because they don't feel, but because commitment carries a lot of emotional weight for them. For an avoidant, committing usually doesn't mean trying something out. It often feels like a final decision. And once they reach that point, they tend to invest deeply. That's why, in the early stages, their behavior can feel confusing, inconsistent, or even emotionally distant. It's not always a lack of interest. It can be a process of internal caution. This is also why I wanted to go over these signs. When you're involved with an avoidant partner, it can often feel uncertain. You might find yourself asking, "Where is this going?" Or, "Does this relationship actually have a future?" Or even, "Am I just wasting my time?" Those questions are very common in these dynamics. And while there's no simple answer that applies to everyone, understanding these patterns can help you interpret what's really happening beneath the surface, instead of relying only on surface-level behavior. So let's start with a very subtle but meaningful sign. It might sound small at first, but avoidant individuals typically do not open up easily to just anyone. Emotional sharing doesn't come naturally or quickly for them. Because of this, one thing you may notice is that they start asking you follow-up questions in moments where the conversation would normally end. For example, you might say something simple like, "How was your day?" And they respond with, "It was fine." You might even leave it there and move on. But later, they circle back and ask you, "How was your day?" Or, "How did your meeting go?" Especially if they knew you had something important happening. On the surface, this seems like a small gesture, but in reality, it reflects something more significant. Avoidant individuals are often very aware of their own discomfort with emotional dependence or appearing too invested. They don't like the feeling of chasing connection or seeming overly eager. In their internal world, that can translate into fear of looking needy or emotionally exposed, even when that's not what's actually happening. However, when an avoidant starts consistently re-engaging, following up, and circling back to your experiences, it usually signals that something is shifting internally. They are moving through their discomfort rather than avoiding it. Their attention is no longer centered on protecting distance, but on maintaining connection. In other words, they begin prioritizing you over their usual emotional defenses. They might not frame it that way, and they may not even consciously recognize it, but their behavior starts showing a soft override of their fear response. They are still cautious, still measured, but they are choosing engagement instead of withdrawal. That's a meaningful indicator. Because avoidant individuals don't typically invest emotional effort into people they don't feel strongly about. If they are consistently checking in, asking questions, and showing curiosity about your day, your experiences, or your emotional state, it's usually because you matter to them more than they are comfortable admitting outright. And that's where a lot of confusion happens in these relationships. Their feelings often grow in silence before they ever become visible in clarity. So while the external behavior may seem minimal or inconsistent, the underlying direction of that behavior is what matters most. And when you start to notice these subtle patterns, especially consistent re-engagement after emotional distance, You're often looking at someone who is slowly allowing you into a space they normally keep heavily guarded. This is part of how avoidant attachment expresses attachment itself. Not through constant verbal reassurance, but through gradual, sometimes hesitant actions that reveal sustained interest over time. And understanding that difference can completely change how you interpret the relationship dynamics, especially when things feel uncertain or emotionally unclear. This is exactly the kind of awareness we continue exploring here at Avoidant Decoded. I'm a practicing therapist and a doctoral student in psychology. My clinical focus is primarily on attachment dynamics, especially individuals carrying unresolved attachment wounds. A significant portion of my work involves people with avoidant attachment patterns, particularly dismissive avoidance, or those with a fearful avoidant style that leans heavily toward dismissal. In this continuation, I want to expand on the earlier discussion and go deeper into additional behavioral signs that can suggest you are becoming a meaningful attachment figure for an avoidantly attached partner. These are often subtle shifts, but when you understand them correctly, they can reveal a lot about emotional investment that isn't always expressed directly. One important shift you may begin to notice is that your partner becomes more descriptive and detailed when talking about their day or personal experiences. In earlier stages of connection, avoidant individuals often keep things very brief. If you ask, "How was your day?" you might get responses like, "It was fine," "It was okay," or "It was productive." Even when something stressful happens, they tend to compress the entire experience into a single word that feels emotionally neutral. There is often a subtle avoidance of emotional exposure, even in everyday conversations. But over time, when someone becomes more significant to them, that pattern often starts to shift. Instead of short, closed responses, they begin offering more context. For example, if you ask about their day, they might start saying things like, "It was actually pretty difficult today. My boss was more demanding than usual." Or, "I had to move between multiple meetings and everything ended up running over schedule, so I was rushing most of the day." What's important here is not just that the story is longer, but that the internal experience is being shared in more detail. Even if they are still not fully emotionally expressive, there is a noticeable increase in narrative depth. They are no longer just labeling the day as busy or fine. They are describing what made it that way. This matters because avoidant individuals often prefer emotional containment. They tend to minimize internal states and avoid unnecessary vulnerability. So when they begin giving you richer descriptions of their lived experience, even without deep emotional language, it usually reflects a growing level of comfort and trust. And in some cases, you may even see moments where emotional vulnerability starts to appear indirectly within those descriptions. Not necessarily dramatic confessions, but small admissions of stress, frustration, or overwhelm that would not have been shared before. That shift, even if subtle, is significant. Another important change you may observe is that they become less rigidly attached to their own independence or personal freedom in the relationship. Now, it's important to be clear about what this actually means, because avoidant individuals are still fundamentally independent in their personality structure. That does not disappear. But the way they relate to independence can soften when they feel emotionally safe with someone. For example, in the earlier phase of a relationship, you might notice that when they go out with friends or travel, like a weekend with friends or a short trip, they tend to be very disconnected during that time. Communication might be minimal, updates may be rare, and there is a strong boundary between their outside life and the relationship. However, as emotional attachment develops, that pattern often begins to shift in a noticeable way. You may start receiving small updates without asking. Things like, "I just landed," or "I'm at the hotel now," or "We're heading out for dinner, I'll text you later." These are simple messages on the surface, but they reflect something important. You are being included in their ongoing experience. They are no longer fully compartmentalizing their life from the relationship. This doesn't mean they are losing independence or becoming dependent. Instead, it suggests that you are becoming part of their internal reference point. Their experiences are no longer completely separate from you, even when they are physically away. And for avoidant individuals, that kind of inclusion is not automatic. It is typically intentional. It reflects value. It reflects emotional prioritization. It reflects that your presence matters enough to stay loosely connected, even when there is no obligation to do so. In other words, their sense of freedom is no longer defined by distance from you. It is now integrated with you in a way that feels safe rather than restrictive. This is a meaningful developmental shift in attachment behavior. The third sign is accountability, and this one is often overlooked because it can seem simple on the surface. In earlier stages of relational difficulty or conflict, avoidant individuals may default to withdrawal, justification, or emotional distancing. Accountability is often uncomfortable because it requires direct engagement with emotional responsibility, which can feel exposing. But when someone becomes more emotionally invested, you may begin to notice a different pattern emerging. Instead of avoiding responsibility or minimizing their role in conflict, they begin to acknowledge their behavior more directly. You might hear statements like, "I shouldn't have raised my voice," or "I was stressed, but that doesn't excuse how I reacted," or "I know I need to work on managing that better." Even if the wording is simple, the shift is meaningful. What matters here is not perfection in communication, but ownership. They are no longer just reacting or defending themselves, they are reflecting. And more importantly, they are connecting their behavior to its impact on you and the relationship. In more developed cases of emotional awareness, this may even extend into behavioral change. Not just saying, "I'm sorry," but actively adjusting how they respond in similar situations over time. That transition from acknowledgement to action is a key indicator of genuine investment, because avoidant individuals do not typically invest emotional energy into self-correction for people they do not value deeply. When they begin trying to regulate their reactions, take responsibility, and actively reduce patterns that harm connection, it suggests that the relationship has moved beyond surface-level involvement. They are no longer just protecting themselves, they are also protecting the connection. And that shift, while not always dramatic, is one of the clearest signs that emotional attachment is deepening in a more stable direction. This is part of what we continue to explore here at Avoidant Decoded. You need to be careful here because this is exactly where a lot of people misinterpret avoidant attachment patterns, especially anxious, preoccupied individuals who tend to overvalue words and underestimate behavior. With avoidant individuals, the framework is often almost reversed. Words don't carry the same weight for them as actions do. They can express care verbally, but what actually reflects their emotional reality is what they consistently do, not what they occasionally say. So when an avoidant starts taking accountability, it's not the apology itself that matters most. It's whether their behavior changes afterward. If they truly value you, that accountability will show up in concrete adjustments over time. That's how their attachment is communicated. Not through emotional speeches, but through behavioral consistency. And this is where things can become confusing for partners who are expecting emotional reassurance through language. Because avoidance may not be highly verbal, their love language, in a sense, is expressed through action, not explanation. So you might miss progress if you're only listening for words instead of observing patterns of behavior. That distinction is crucial. Now, another pattern that tends to show up, particularly in avoidant men, though not exclusively, is something I would describe as decision softening, or what some might call backseat decision-making in the relationship. Avoidant individuals often have a strong internal need for control. This isn't always obvious, but it usually comes from a deep discomfort with vulnerability and uncertainty. If they feel like they are not steering their own life, it can trigger a sense of inadequacy or loss of stability. In many cases, this tendency can be reinforced by social expectations placed on men around leadership, independence, and control, although it can exist in any gender. However, when an avoidant begins to feel emotionally secure in a relationship, you may notice a gradual softening of that need to control every outcome. For example, in earlier stages, they might be very particular about plans, finances, travel details, or how things are done. They may insist on doing things their way because predictability gives them emotional safety. But as trust develops, that rigidity often relaxes. So instead of pushing back strongly, they may start allowing you to lead certain decisions. You might suggest a vacation, where to go, what kind of hotel to book, what type of room to choose. And instead of needing everything aligned with their preferences, they become more flexible. Not passive, but more adaptable. They might still express their preferences, like wanting to use certain hotel chains for rewards points or cost efficiency. But the difference is, they are no longer resisting your preferences just to maintain control. They are integrating your needs into the decision-making process rather than competing with them. That shift is subtle, but meaningful. It shows that collaboration is becoming more comfortable than control. Another important indicator is when an avoidant begins to care more deeply about how you perceive them. This is often overlooked, but it is actually quite significant. If you express that something they said or did came across as harsh, dismissive, or unfair, their response starts to matter in a different way than before. In earlier dynamics, they might have defended themselves, minimized the issue, or emotionally distanced from the feedback. But when attachment deepens, your emotional experience begins to register more strongly for them. They may still feel a brief moment of defensiveness, that's normal, but it is often followed by reflection. You might hear things like, "I didn't mean it that way," or "I see why that came across wrong," or "I'm sorry, I didn't consider how that would feel for you." What's happening underneath is not just conflict management, it is identity regulation. They do not want to be seen as someone who hurts you or misunderstands you, because your perception of them starts to carry emotional weight. Avoidant individuals are often protective of how they are perceived by people they value. If they care about you, your opinion of them becomes internally relevant. They don't want to lose respect in your eyes, and they don't want to be misaligned with the person you think they are. When you look at this section as a whole, the underlying theme is a gradual shift from emotional self-protection to emotional cooperation within the relationship. With avoidantly attached individuals, the early pattern is usually centered around independence, control, and emotional self-reliance. They are used to handling decisions alone, managing stress internally, and maintaining a strong sense of separation between me and we. This is not because they don't care about others, but because closeness can historically feel overwhelming or unsafe for their nervous system. So when attachment begins to develop in a healthier direction, you don't usually see a dramatic personality change. Instead, you see small but consistent behavioral shifts that signal increasing trust. One of those shifts is when they begin seeking your perspective before making decisions. In the beginning stages, avoidant individuals tend to make decisions independently. Even in relationships, they may feel more comfortable operating as if they are still fully self-contained. Asking for input can feel like losing control or becoming too emotionally dependent, which they unconsciously resist. But as trust grows, something important changes internally. Your perspective starts to feel like a resource rather than an interference. Instead of seeing decision-making as something they must protect, they start seeing it as something that can be shared. So, when they begin asking, "What do you think?" it is not just about the decision itself, it reflects a deeper shift in relational orientation. They are no longer just acting as an isolated individual, they are beginning to include you in their internal processing. This does not mean they are becoming dependent or unable to function alone. It means they are no longer rigidly excluding you from their decision-making space. That integration is a key sign of emotional trust. It shows that your opinion carries weight in their internal world, not just in conversation. Closely connected to this is the idea that they are not outsourcing responsibility, but rather integrating your judgment. This distinction is very important. Avoidant individuals do not typically abandon autonomy easily. Even when they become more relational, they still maintain a strong sense of self-direction. So when they involve you in decisions, they are not giving up control. They are expanding their framework to include you. It becomes a we-based consideration instead of a purely me-based one. That transition reflects emotional safety. They feel safe enough not to lose themselves in the relationship, which allows them to bring you closer without perceiving it as a threat to their identity. Another major shift appears in how they respond to emotional triggers. In earlier stages of attachment, certain experiences, like criticism, emotional intensity, perceived demands, or conflict, can activate their defense system very quickly. This often results in withdrawal, emotional shutdown, defensiveness, or distancing behaviors. These reactions are not random. They are protective mechanisms designed to restore a sense of emotional control and safety. However, as trust deepens over time, those same triggers begin to lose their intensity. This does not mean the triggers disappear entirely. Instead, the nervous system becomes less reactive. Situations that once caused emotional withdrawal may now be tolerated, processed, or even discussed without immediate shutdown. For example, where they might have previously pulled away during conflict, they may now stay present in the conversation. Where they once became defensive in response to feedback, they may now pause and reflect before responding. In some cases, they may even respond constructively rather than reactively. This shift is not about suppression or pretending to be calm. It reflects genuine regulation. Their internal threat response is no longer being activated at the same level because the relationship itself is beginning to feel safer. And this is where the deeper meaning of emotional safety comes in. Emotional safety does not mean the absence of disagreement or stress. It means that the presence of those things no longer signals danger to the attachment system. The relationship is no longer interpreted as something that must be protected from closeness, conflict, or emotional intensity. Instead, it becomes something that can withstand those experiences without breaking connection. So when you observe fewer defensive reactions, more stability during emotionally charged moments, and a greater willingness to stay engaged instead of withdrawing, you are often seeing a nervous system that is learning to trust connection rather than fear it. That is the core transformation taking place beneath the surface. From a clinical attachment perspective, this is one of the clearest indicators that the relationship is moving from an activation of avoidance strategies toward a more secure relational pattern. It is not perfection, and it is not the absence of triggers, but it is a meaningful reduction in the automatic need to disconnect in order to feel safe. In simpler terms, they are no longer experiencing the relationship primarily as a threat to their autonomy. Instead, they are beginning to experience it as a stable base, where closeness does not require self-abandonment. And that is what allows avoidant individuals to remain present. Not because they are forced to, but because their system no longer insists that distance is the only way to stay safe. This is the final and most important layer of what is being described here under avoidant decoded.